History doesn't always repeat, but it does rhyme. And lately, it's starting to sound like a remix nobody asked for. ICE raids major U.S. cities, families detained during routine check ins, local officials blindsided by federal operations, wrong addresses, wrong people, no apologies. And somewhere, someone is still saying, well, if you just follow the law, yeah, about that. Because what we are watching right now isn't about border security. It's not about public safety. And it sure in the hell isn't about legality. It's about power. It's about normalization. And it's about how we got from protect the border to kick indoors 3 states inland without ever having the adult conversation in between. Tonight, we are talking about ICE, where it started, how it changed, who supercharged it, and why pretending this is just how it has always been is a lie. Let's hold them accountable. Before we get into what ICE is doing now, we have to deal with a very inconvenient truth. ICE has not always existed, not in the way people talk about it, not in the way that it operates today, and definitely not in the way it is being used as a political weapon. ICE is not some ancient pillar of American law enforcement. It's younger than Facebook. It was created in 2003, and that matters because when someone says this is just how immigration enforcement works, what they usually mean is this is how it has worked since we stopped paying attention. So let's rewind. Before we argue about what ICE should be doing, we have to be honest about what it was designed to become. Because the most dangerous lie in politics is the phrase, this is how it's always been. It hasn't. ICE is not ancient. It is not foundational. It is not embedded in the Constitution like free speech or due process. ICE is a modern invention. And like most modern inventions, it reflects the fears, incentives, and shortcuts of the moment that created it. So let's slow this down. Let's walk through it carefully because once you see the progression, what's happening now stops looking accidental. Before ICE, immigration enforcement lived under one agency, the Immigration and Naturalization Service, INS. INS handled visas, green cards, naturalization, deportations, and border enforcement. Was it perfect? No. Was it bureaucratic, slow, and paperwork heavy? Absolutely. But here's the key difference. Immigration violations were treated primarily as civil matters, not criminal threats. Most enforcement was reactive, not aggressive. Deportations followed hearings. Raids were rare. Local police were not routinely involved. Immigration enforcement was boring, and boring is often what accountability looks like. Then came September 11th. And after 9/11, United States made a decision that still shapes policy today. We decided that immigration and national security would be treated as the same issue. Congress created the Department of Homeland Security. INS was dismantled, and Immigration and Customs Enforcement was born. ICE officially launched in 2003 under the newly formed Department of Homeland Security. Its stated mission sounded reasonable: prevent terrorism, combat transnational crime, secure borders, but structure matters. ICE was built as a law enforcement agency, not a civil administration. Agents carried weapons or tactical gear, operated with enforcement first instincts. And once you frame immigration as a security threat, every migrant becomes a potential suspect. That framing never really went away. Under George W. Bush, ICE expanded quietly. Budgets increased. Detention contracts multiplied. Information sharing systems grew. But the key thing to understand is this: Bush didn't unleash ICE on cities. He built capacity, detention beds, databases, enforcement partnerships. This is when the machinery was constructed, not the spectacle. And because it wasn't loud, it didn't attract much scrutiny. Congress kept funding it. The public stayed focused elsewhere, and the system grew without meaningful limits. Now, let's get to the most misunderstood chapter in the story: the Obama years. Yes, deportations increased under Barack Obama. That's true, but how they happen matters more than the raw numbers. Most removals during this period came from border enforcement and recent arrivals. Interior enforcement still existed, but it was guided by priorities, serious crimes, violent offenses, recent crossings. ICE was told, at least on paper, who they were not supposed to target. This is also when programs like Secure Communities expanded, linking local jails to federal databases. The intent was targeted enforcement. The result was mixed because even with priorities, the infrastructure kept growing. Obama tried to steer the machine, he did not dismantle it. And once you build a system designed for enforcement, you don't get to be shocked when a future administration uses it aggressively. Then came Donald Trump. Trump didn't invent ICE. He didn't invent detention. He didn't invent deportation. What he did was remove the restraint and add spectacle. Overnight, enforcement priorities vanished. ICE agents were told if they are undocumented, they are a target. Not violent, not dangerous, not recent. Everyone. Raids became press events. Cruelty became deterrence theater, and fear became policy. Courthouses were no longer safe. Check-ins became traps. Children became collateral damage. ICE wasn't just enforcing law anymore. It was enforcing a political narrative. And once cruelty becomes normalized, it does not disappear easily. Here's the part people miss. Institutions have memory. Agents trained under one administration don't magically reset under the next. Policies change faster than culture. Budgets outlast presidents. And fear, once legitimized, doesn't politely excuse itself. What we are seeing today is not sudden escalation. It is the echo of choices made over the years. That's the rhyme. ICE didn't become what it is overnight. It was shaped, expanded, normalized. And every step along the way, someone said, we'll fix it later. Later is now. Everything we just walked through in the history section wasn't academic, wasn't nostalgia, it wasn't trivia, it was the setup. Because what ICE is doing right now only makes sense if you understand how we got here. And right now, ICE is no longer primarily a border agency. It's an interior enforcement force operating inside American cities with broad discretion and very little public visibility. That's the reality. Everything else is spin. Let's be precise with language. Interior enforcement means ICE operations away from the border. Homes, apartments, workplaces, courthouses, routine check-ins, people who are not crossing anything, people who are already here. Over the last year, ICE has ramped up these operations quietly. No big press conferences, no dramatic announcements, just agents showing up where people live. And that's intentional because border enforcement polls well, interior raids don't. So they don't advertise them, they normalize them. Here's how this usually works. An ICE agent knocks on a door, sometimes early morning, sometimes late at night, and they say they're just asking questions. They say, need to confirm information. They may show paperwork, but most of the time, it is not a judicial warrant. It's an administrative warrant, signed internally, not approved by a judge. And here's the critical part. If someone opens the door and steps outside, ICE considers that consent. Consent created by confusion. Consent created by fear. Consent created by not knowing your rights. This is not accidental. It is procedural. ICE does not need everyone to comply. They only need enough people to not know the rules. Most people don't know the difference between criminal warrant and an administrative one. Most people don't know they don't have to open the door. Most people assume law enforcement always has authority. That assumption is what ICE relies on. Not force, not violence, confusion. Once the confusion becomes policy, mistakes aren't mistakes anymore. They are features. You'll often hear officials say, well, mistakes happen. Wrong house, wrong person, wrong address. But here's the thing. When mistakes happen repeatedly, across states, across years under different administrations, that's not error. That's design. ICE regularly arrests people who were not the original target. Family members, roommates, coworkers. They call these collateral arrest, which is a very clean phrase for a very messy reality. Means you were not suspected, not sought, but now you're detained anyway. That's not precision. That's drift. One of the most chilling shifts has been where ICE chooses to operate courthouses, probation offices, mandatory check ins, places where people are required to show up. For years, these locations were treated as sensitive, off limits, because if people fear arrest for showing up, they stop showing up. ICE knows this, and they've decided it's worth it. That's not law enforcement, that's coercion. Let's talk about impact, not ideology, not slogans, impact. When ICE ramps up interior enforcement, crime reporting drop, domestic violence reports drop, wage theft reports drop, witness cooperation drops. Not because crime disappears, but because trust does. Parents stop driving kids to school. Workers stop showing up to jobs. People stop calling for help. Fear doesn't make communities safer. It makes them quieter. And quiet is often mistaken for order. This isn't speculation. Civil rights groups, labor advocates, and law enforcement associations have all documented the same pattern. Aggressive ICE operations undermine public safety. Not in theory, in practice. Look what's going on right now in Chicago, Minnesota, possibly Philadelphia, LA, possibly Indianapolis, which raises the obvious question: if this doesn't make us safer, why do it? Because ICE interior enforcement serves a different function. It reassures some voters that something is being done. It creates visible consequences. It sends a message, not to people crossing borders, but to people already living here. The message is simple: you are never fully safe. It's not about law, that's about control. What makes this a hot button issue is not just what ICE is doing, it's the timing. We are watching a familiar escalation, quietly, incrementally, with plausible deniability. This is the moment where normalization happens. And once it's normal, it's very hard to roll back, which brings us to the final question. If this is the system we have, is it the system we want? And if not, what are we going to do about it? And I know you're asking yourself, hasn't this happened before? Patience, grasshopper, patience. Before we move into the fix, we're going to do something very simple. We're going to ground this conversation in evidence, not vibes, not hypotheticals, not worst case scenarios. 4 receipts. That's it. Because when people hear uncomfortable historical parallels, the reflex is always the same. You're exaggerating. So let's document first. According to data compiled by the Transactional Records Access Clearinghouse, the majority of ICE arrests and interior enforcement operations are not of people with violent criminal convictions. Many have no criminal record at all, or only minor civil or traffic offenses. This matters because enforcement is justified publicly as targeting dangerous criminals. The data says otherwise. That gap between rhetoric and reality is where normalization begins. Multiple studies summarized by the Cato Institute show that aggressive interior immigration enforcement does not reduce crime rates. What it does reduce is cooperation with law enforcement. Victims stop reporting crimes. Witnesses stop testifying. Communities withdraw. A system that weakens public safety while claiming to protect it should raise questions. The American Civil Liberties Union has documented that ICE interior operations correlate with lower school attendance, higher labor exploitation, increased domestic abuse going unreported, not because these problems increased, but because reporting decreased. Fear doesn't eliminate harm, it hides it. Since its creation, ICE's budget and detention capacity have grown dramatically, often without proportional increases in oversight mechanisms. Congress funded growth far more consistency than reform. That is not accidental. That's institutional incentive. So now we know three things. One, enforcement is broader than advertised. Two, the harm is documented. Three, oversight lags behind power. Those conditions are not new, they are familiar, which brings us to the part of the conversation people are always uncomfortable having. Not because it's inaccurate, but because it's recognizable. No one serious is saying this is 1930s Europe. Different countries, different systems, different outcomes. But history doesn't need to repeat itself to teach us something. It only needs to rhyme. And the rhyme begins the same way it always does. In 1930s Europe, the groundwork was laid. The groundwork was not laid by villains twirling mustaches. It was laid by crisis, economic collapse, political instability, social anxiety. People wanted order, predictability, someone to make the uncertainty stop. Governments responded by expanding enforcement powers in the name of security. Not immediately violent, gradually bureaucratic. Registries, identification requirements, expanded police discretion. At first, it was all legal. That's the part people forget. Before atrocities, there were agencies. Before camps, there were records. Before mass violence, there were laws that redefined who was suspicious and who belonged. In Nazi Germany, early enforcement mechanisms were sold as crime control and national protection. The Gestapo did not begin as a symbol of terror. It became as a security service operating with broad discretion and limited oversight. The danger wasn't that everyone supported brutality. It was that many people accepted expansion because it didn't target them. This is the critical phase. Not collapse, not violence, normalization. When extraordinary powers become routine. When enforcement presence becomes background noise. When people say, well, that's just how it works now. In 1930s Europe, this phase lasted years, not weeks, not months, years. By the time the consequences were undeniable, the infrastructure was already in place. That's the rhyme. Today, we see similar structural elements: broad enforcement authority, limited oversight, administrative processes replacing judicial ones, the use of fear as deterrence, the targeting of defined outgroups, the justification of harm as necessity. Again, not the same outcome, but the same warning signs. History does not ask permission before it starts rhyming. The lesson of the 30s is not that cruelty happens overnight, it's that systems drift when people stop interrogating. Democracy doesn't usually fall to coups. It erodes through paperwork, policy memos, and the normalization of harm against people with the least power to resist. That is the danger zone. The point of history is not comparison for shock value. It's recognition. When we see institutions expand without restraint, when fear becomes policy, when harm is dismissed as collateral, history isn't repeating, but it is rhyming. And the question is whether we hear it before the verse changes. When people hear fix immigration, they usually imagine something dramatic: a wall, a sweep, a single bill that magically resolves decades of policy failure. That fantasy is how we keep getting stuck. Fixing this doesn't mean eliminating enforcement. It doesn't mean pretending borders don't exist. And it doesn't mean ignoring the rule of law. It means aligning power with purpose and restoring limits where they are intentionally removed. So let's walk through this carefully. The first fix is also the most important. Congress must define ICE's mission in statute, not guidance, not internal memos, not press statements, law. Right now, enforcement priorities can be expanded or erased by a single administration. That's not stability, that's whiplash. If ICE is meant to focus on serious threats, then serious threat must be defined. Violent crimes, human trafficking, large-scale fraud, not whoever we find. Because when priorities aren't written into law, discretion becomes ideology, and ideology is not a standard. Second, ICE must be required to obtain judicial warrants before entering homes. Administrative warrants are not sufficient to override constitutional protections. This isn't conversational. Police need warrants. Federal agents need warrants. Immigration enforcement should be no different. If a judge won't sign it, the door stays closed. That single change would immediately reduce abuse, mistaken arrest, and coercive encounters because sunlight changes behavior. Third, we must restore the firewall between local law enforcement and federal immigration enforcement. Police departments exist to protect communities, not to serve as data pipeline for deportation machinery. When immigrants trust police, crimes get reported, witnesses cooperate, communities stabilize. This is not ideological, it's operational. Cities that limit ICE entanglement see better public safety outcomes. That's the data. Immigration courts are overwhelmed. Cases drag for years. People live in legal limbo. Families remain separated by delay, not danger. Speed is not justice. Access is. That means funding immigration courts, guaranteeing access to counsel, ending detention as default. If the system can't process cases fairly, then enforcement only multiplies injustice. Due process is not a loophole, it's the point. Finally, ICE must be overseen by entities that can actually intervene. Independent inspectors, public reporting requirements, real consequences for abuse, not internal reviews that quietly disappear. Power without oversight always expands. That's not cynical, that's historic. These are real fixes. None of them require fantasy legislation. None of them eliminate enforcement, and all of them are achievable. But policy doesn't move on its own. It moves when people push it, which brings us to the call to action. I don't do vague calls to action. I don't say get involved and hope for the best. I give you one thing you can actually do that matters. Here it is. If ICE comes to a door, people need to know 4 things. They do not have to open the door. They can ask for a warrant. They can remain silent. They can call a lawyer. This knowledge saves families. Not hypothetically, practically. Share Know Your Rights materials from trusted organizations. Print them, post them, text them. Information is protection. If you want to go one step further, support local immigration legal aid groups. Representation changes outcomes. People with lawyers are more likely to stay with their families, more likely to comply with the law, and more likely to resolve cases fairly. This is not charity. It's due process and action. This is the part of the show where we stop dancing around systems and start naming behavior. No strawmen, no anonymous blame clouds, no both sides fog. 7 calls tonight, 4 folds, 3 holds. Let's begin. Fold number 1 goes to lawmakers who vote to expand enforcement budgets and then act surprised by the outcomes. You don't get to fund detention beds, expand authority, and then release a statement saying, well, this isn't what we intended. If you wrote the check, you own the consequences. Concern without action is branding, not leadership. Fold them. Fold number 2 goes to anyone who responds to abuse with the phrase, well, they should have just followed the law. That's not analysis. That's abdication. Laws don't enforce themselves. Agencies interpret them. People apply them. And when enforcement is arbitrary, telling people to just comply is how injustice hides in plain sight. Fold them. Fold number 3 goes to media outlets that repeat phrases like violent criminals without checking the data. If you amplify fear without context, you're not informing, you're laundering. Journalism that doesn't interrogate power becomes a megaphone for it. Fold them. Fold 4 goes to officials who know this system causes harm and say nothing because it's politically inconvenient. Silence is not neutrality, it's permission. And history is very clear about how much damage that kind of silence enables. Fold them. Now, credit where it's earned, because accountability isn't just about calling people out. It's also about recognizing resistance. Fold number 1 goes to immigration attorneys and legal aid organizations doing the unglamorous work, standing between families and deportation, explaining rights, showing up when no cameras are around. They don't make speeches, they make outcomes. Hold them. Hold number 2 goes to local leaders who set clear boundaries between community policing and federal immigration enforcement. Not because it's trendy, because it works. Public safety improves when trust exists. That's leadership rooted in reality. Hold them. And hold number 3 goes to everyday people who refuse to shrug this off, who ask questions, who read past the headlines, who notice when systems drift. Democracy doesn't survive because institutions are strong. It survives because people pay attention. Hold them. By now, nobody watching this can honestly say, I didn't know. We've all seen the videos. We've all watched people get injured by ICE. We walked through the history. We laid out the receipts. We showed how the systems worked, how it drifted, and how it keeps drifting because people pretending drift is harmless. So let's stop pretending. What we're talking about tonight is not immigration, it's power. And more specifically, how much power we are willing to tolerate being exercised without restraint as long as it's pointed at someone else. Every system eventually answers one question. Who is it for? Not in the mission statements, not in speeches, in practice. When enforcement expands faster than oversight, when fear replaces due process, when harm is dismissed as collateral, the system is no longer for safety, it's for control. And here's the uncomfortable part. Systems like that don't need bad people to function. They only need tired people, distracted people, people willing to say, well, that's complicated, and keep scrolling. That's how normalization works. Not with a bang, with a shrug. History doesn't show up wearing a warning label. It never has. Shows up as policy tweaks, budget increases, expanded discretion, temporary measures that somehow never expire. In the 30s and 40s, the warning signs weren't dramatic at first. They were administrative, registries, papers, special authorities justified as necessary. People told themselves, this is about order. This is about security. This is not about me. Until it was. No one wakes up one morning and decides to live in an abusive system. They arrive there incrementally by tolerating the previous step. That's the rhyme. The real test of democracy is not how it treats people with power. It's how it treats people without it. People who don't vote, people who don't poll well, people who are easy to dehumanize because they are always described as abstractions. When we accept cruelty, as long as it's procedural, we don't preserve order. We hollow it out. And once you normalize the idea that rights are conditional, you don't get to choose where that logic stops. Power never does. At some point, everyone involved has to choose. Lawmakers can't keep funding enforcement and acting shocked by the outcomes. Media can't keep amplifying fear and calling it balanced. Voters can't keep saying, well, both sides are bad, and washing their hands of responsibility. There is no neutral position when systems cause predictable harm. Silence is a decision. Inaction is a decision. Normalization is a decision. And history keeps receipts. Here's the line. A government that can enter homes without judicial oversight is not enforcing order. It's testing limits. A system that relies on fear to function is not strong. It's brittle. A system that allows a mother to be shot in her car dropping off her kids is not strong. It's fearful. And a democracy that tolerates harm as long as it's legal is one that has forgotten why legality exists in the first place. Law is supposed to restrain power, not excuse it. Nothing we talked about tonight is inevitable. The system was built by chaos, expanded by choices, maintained by choices, which means it can be changed by choices, but only if we stop lying to ourselves about what we are seeing, only if we stop pretending that this is someone else's problem. History does not repeat, but it does rhyme. Right now, the rhyme is getting louder. The question is whether we hear it while there's still time to change the verse. Stay engaged, stay curious, and remember, democracy only works when we hold them accountable.